That's my alarm. Okay, now we'll see if my notes match up to the slides. Here we go, let's start there. So, it is perhaps almost commonplace now to note the dispiriting sense of a future that has never arrived. The late anthropologist and anarchist David Graeber, writing in 2015, bemoaned the conspicuous absence of flying cars and what he calls the profound sense of disappointment that the future he and his generation were living in was not the one that they had been promised. Graeber writes, "Did I honestly expect I would be living in a world of such wonders? Of course, everyone did. And so do I feel cheated now? Absolutely. Certainly, I didn't think I'd see all the things we read about in science fiction realized in my lifetime, but it never occurred to me that I wouldn't see any of them." Franco Bifo Berardi expresses the same feeling, stating, "When I say future, I'm not referring to a direction of time. I am thinking rather of the psychological perception which emerged in the cultural situation of progressive modernity. I'll never be able to live in accordance with the new reality, no matter how evident, unmistakable, or even dazzling its social planetary trends." These sentiments are best summarized by Berardi's phrase, "the slow cancellation of the future." Hauntology emerged in recent decades as a means of expressing and addressing this affliction. As Fisher writes, "What haunts the digital cul-de-sacs of the 21st century is not so much the past as all the lost futures that the 20th century taught us to anticipate." The disappearance of the future meant the deterioration of a whole mode of social imagination, the capacity to conceive of a world radically different from the one in which we currently live. What is it that has disappeared then? For Fisher, it's not so much a particular object as a trajectory, a virtual trajectory he names as popular modernism. Not a particular period, no formal nostalgia, but we long for the resumption of the processes of democratization and pluralism that popular modernism trained us to expect. Fisher famously summed up the deflation of expectations about the future as capitalist realism. I would like to add the sci-fi author and activist Cory Doctorow's concept of enshittification to this equation. Doctorow is describing a process relating to technologies familiar to anyone who remembers cyberspace as it used to be, or rather, once promised to be. The ins and outs of enshittification are less important for this paper than the observations shared by both Fisher and Doctorow about the impacts of late-stage capitalism on new technologies. Fisher wrote that Bill Gates promised business at the speed of thought, but what capitalism delivers is thought at the speed of business. Just as hauntology is not about simple nostalgia, Doctorow highlights that the pre-enshittification era wasn't a time of better leadership. The executives weren't better, but, he goes on, they were constrained. Their worst impulses were checked by competition, regulation, self-help, and worker power. So what happened? One by one, each of these constraints was eroded, leading the enshittificatory impulse unchecked, ushering in the enshitocene. It is also worth briefly noting Graeber's equally foul-mouthed concept of bullshit jobs fits with these general trends. In short, to quote Fisher again, capitalism has abandoned the future because it couldn't deliver it. In his unfinished work on acid communism, Fisher moved towards a concept that Tom Wyman suggests can be seen as an experiment in applied hauntology, changing the present by returning to the past, first to understand what went wrong, and then to re-implement the message we failed to act upon the first time round. I want to bring these ideas into focus by applying them to the broad range of philosophies and practices that have come to be called transhumanism. In other words, to posit the transhuman as one more lost future that haunts us, and, perhaps, point to some ways in which we could re-engage with some of its key ideas. Transhumanist ideas can be said to go back centuries, but really developed speed in the latter part of the 20th century. Transhumanists come in different stripes and flavors, but all are united in the idea of enhancing or augmenting human abilities through the use of technology. In other words, transhumanists see current humanity as simply a work in progress, a transitional phase on the evolutionary road to something fully post-human. Transhumanist thinkers point to and draw upon a number of converging technologies, variously known by the acronyms GRAIN or NBIC. Such technologies include nanotech, genetic engineering, AI, and robotics in various admixtures. The literature around transhumanism imagines a world in which the use of such technologies to enhance and expand human capabilities is both commonplace and, crucially, voluntary. However, The prevalence of these technologies and even their feasibility in terms of something like mind uploading are at best unevenly distributed. Nevertheless, as Gibson succinctly expressed it, the street finds its own use for things. The rise of the open science movement of DIY biology, biohacking and grinding point to further and stranger directions for transhumanism. According to the biohacker artist and activist Josiah Zayner, biohackers are people who experiment on their own bodies and other organisms outside traditional labs and institutions. Such experiments are often aesthetic as they are practical. Zayner claims, I want to live in a world where people get drunk and instead of giving themselves tattoos, they're like, I'm drunk, I'm going to CRISPR myself. And perhaps even more provocatively, I always talk about how we all want dragons. We all want these mystical creatures to exist in the world and our lives. And it really is possible to be able to create these things. Since the 1980s, artists like Stellark and Neil Harbison have combined science, technology, and art practices. Their work, as well as Zayner's creation of the chromochord, an instrument whose music is produced by translating the reaction of oat proteins to light into sound, blur the lines between science and art. As Wiesek suggests in their article on Gods, Pixies and Humans, Biohacking and the Genetic Imaginary, the realm of art is the realm of the symbolic, and the realm of natural and life sciences is generally understood as the field of verifiable facts. Yet these differences may be blurred by biohacking itself. A crafted bioengineer working on projects such as transforming his or her own body may be seen as mediating between art and science. While many transhumanists root their philosophy in an Enlightenment tradition that places faith in reason and progress, we can also discern a mystical or Gnostic narrative in much transhumanist philosophy. I've referred to this elsewhere as the discourse of the cosmic body, a form of transhumanism that places a heavy emphasis on consciousness expansion and spirituality rather than simply physical enhancements. This represents an important counter-narrative to, for example, eugenicist discourses of the perfect body or the military-industrial body of the super soldier. Similarly, the subcultures of grinding and biohacking merge art and science in ways that move transhumanist practices into the realm of the aesthetic rather than the merely functional. It's this discourse of the cosmic posthuman that I want to suggest is one of the lost futures haunting the transhumanist movement. And to understand its disappearance, we must return to the cultural milieu from which it first emerged, the world of groovy science. Kaiser and McKay's Groovy Science, Knowledge, Innovation in the American Counterculture, coins the term groovy science to describe a wide cluster of work and key thinkers, including, among others, Timothy Leary, Michael Murphy, Esalen and the Human Potential Movement, Maslow's Humanistic Psychology, and John C. Lilly's work with psychedelics and interspecies communication. Groovy science, they write, was an amalgam of earnestness and playfulness, an unsteady mix, often fueled by a sense that society was on the brink of some new revolution. Benjamin Breen's recent tripping on utopia is a welcome addition to the literature here, extending our understanding of the birth of groovy science through its history of Margaret Mead and the psychedelic research of the 40s and 50s. As Breen suggests, Mead, Gregory Bateson, and others within the so-called Macy Circle were representatives of the deeply idealistic moment in the history of science in which they came of age, the period in the late 20s and early 30s that witnessed a revolution in scientific understandings of personality, culture, and sexuality that has been likened to modernism in the arts and literature. Like the groovy scientists that would follow in the 60s and 70s, they expressed a commitment to applied interdisciplinary science that not only challenged conventional norms, but explicitly sought to create a new global culture. To take one specific example from Kaiser and McKay's selection, Andrew Kirk describes the countercultural bricoleurs that comprised the Alloy happening in March 1969. Promoted by the Whole Earth Catalogue Stuart Brand and organised by Stephen Bayer, a solar technology pioneer, Alloy gathered over 150 attendees over several days and nights with a mind to launching a design science revolution, heavily influenced by the ideas of Buckminster Fuller. The ecotopian solution they developed did not reject technology, science, or material possessions. It was no retreat back to the wilderness, but a belief in remaking the material world into a place that balanced nature and culture. Robert Crumb's strip, A Short History of America, illustrates the idea by comparing three possible visions of the future: the ecological disaster, the fun science fiction imagined by David Graeber, and the Alloy vision of the ecotopian solution. It's from this milieu of groovy science that the Stanford Research Institute's report Changing Images of Man emerged. It shares the emphasis on interdisciplinary, even omnidisciplinary, as Fuller put it, research, and a concern with balancing technology and ecology. Editor Willis Harman was an engineer and futurist who would go on to found the parapsychological research group, the Institute of Noetic Science, while co-editor Oliver Markley was principal investigator and consultant with SRI's Management and Social Systems Group. The various authors and advisors read like something of a who's who of groovy academics, perhaps most notably the mythologist Joseph Campbell and psychedelic researcher Richard Alpert. The interdisciplinary bent is also reflected in the sources, which include the aforementioned Bucky Fuller, Maslow, both Aldous and his brother Julian Huxley, who had earlier coined the term transhumanism, Jung, Simone de Beauvoir, Teilhard de Chardin, and at least one somewhat admonishing reference to the good Dr. Timothy Leary. As well as sharing sources and key personnel with others in the realms of groovy science, Changing Images of Man takes a similar approach to what science is or could be, emphasizing parapsychological research and the use of psychedelic drugs, sometimes at the same time, as future directions for scientific endeavor. Actually, I'll go back one. Moreover, as Harman notes in the introduction, the approach taken did not attempt to follow the research methods associated with any particular academic or applied methodology, since our aim is to break out of set patterns of thinking and hence recognize useful new ways of thinking and imaging. Changing Images of Man emerged against a backdrop of ecological and technological concerns, in particular what the MIT's 1972 report Limits to Growth, which used the World Free Computer model to simulate interactions between the Earth and human systems, called the predicament, or what Changing Images of Man refers to as the world macro problem, or the crises of crises. The combinatory consequences of rapid population growth, resource depletion, pollution, and the anomic reaction to accelerating technological change that Alvin Toffler's contemporaneous bestseller describes as future shock. Commissioned by the Charles Kettering Foundation to predict and direct social policy with an aim to developing a plausible vision of the future in which democratic methods survived, while still undergoing a paradigm shift into a new holistic image of humankind and its relationship to spaceship Earth, and at least implicitly, realms beyond Earth, both inner and outer. Chapters 1 lays out the central thesis of the book. Their working definition of an image of man describes a set of assumptions held about human beings' origins, a Gestalt perception, both individual and collective, in relation to the self, others, society, and the cosmos. They argue that images influence perceptions and behaviors, and as such, have the ability to bring about social change. This is integrated in the diagram here that I've included here. I've also been sure to include Margaret Mead's pithy comment, "This diagram is too simplistic." Chapter 2 attempts the mammoth task of mapping the dominant images of humankind throughout history, from the Middle Paleolithic image of the hunter, through the Neolithic image of the planter, to onwards through the Greek image of human as tragic hero, into the Industrial Revolution's image of economic man, and onto the emerging post-war vision of the human as goal-directed adaptive system. This cybernetic image, they note, has not yet reached takeoff point. I do not believe that space-age idiom to be coincidental. Chapter 3 focuses more closely on the image of economic man and its influence on social policy in order to outline its obsolescence in the face of a quickly changing post-industrial society. It's here that the world macro problem is most pointed. In short, while our economic image has become less and less capable of guiding the societal context caused by technological change, there has also been a decline of constructive utopian thinking. A quote from Keniston from 1965 they use argues that the vast majority of our serious visions of the future are negative visions, extensions of the most pernicious trends of the present. It's here that Changing Images of Man chimes presciently with the slow cancellation of the future. Chapter 4 examines the influence of science on the image of man and is perhaps the most typical of the groovy science approach, arguing for a paradigm shift that would reconcile the objective and the subjective, an eclectic interdisciplinary approach, and numerous references to parapsychological research. ESP, the links between quantum mechanics and brain research, yoga, meditation, hypnosis, cosmic consciousness, clairvoyance, and telekinesis, even going so far as to confidently assert that these former topics of mysticism are moving into the domain of scientific verification. Having established how the predominant image of humankind in a society shapes the social environment, and being good systems theorists, how the social environment in turn shapes that society's image, the following 4 chapters attempt to map out an adequate image of humankind fit for the post-industrial age. This adequate image, they argue, would include the following elements: a holistic sense of perspective, ecological ethic, self-realization ethic, be multidimensional, balanced and coordinated, and experimental and open-ended. The question then becomes how to implement such an image. Chapter 7 lays out the societal choices and consequences presented by what they call the technological extrapolationist image and the evolutionary transformationalist image of the future. We will return to those in due course. In attempting to synthesize and integrate previous images, and by pointing to then contemporary trends suggestive of a march in the direction of that image, the report also reminds us of Fisher's second sense of hauntology, that which in actuality has not yet happened, but which is already effective in the virtual, an attractor, an anticipation shaping current behavior. One way perhaps of understanding changing images of man is an act of hyperstitional engineering, or a deliberate fictioning. Recall that their central premise is that when images lead social development, they are anticipatory and provide direction for social change. When images are in this relation to society, they exert what Pollock has termed a magnetic pull towards the future. The authors of Changing Images of Man were in the business of mimetically engineering a strange attractor. It should be noted that this is no Marxist text. The authors of Changing Images of Man envision a world in which corporations and world leaders embrace this new image of humanity. With an optimism that is perhaps typical of the time and place from which it emerged, they write that there arises a demand that the largest corporations assume a social responsibility towards all those whose lives they affect. This response would involve modifications to the operative goals of the corporations, such that they include, on a par with earned return to stockholders, the 2 additional goals of providing opportunities for meaningful work and providing tangible benefits to society. Elsewhere, co-editor Willis Harman suggested that such a change could be surpassed with people having experienced for themselves the feelings of interconnectedness that came from LSD use or meditation and mysticism. The tech industry in particular, given its localization in California, has been quick to embrace such ideas as new management techniques or to facilitate creativity and productivity in their workers. The ayahuasca retreat as team-building exercise. It's these links that make Changing Images of Man an investigation into the strand of what I've called cosmic transhumanism. In its exploration of these nascent technologies like genetic modifications, brain implants, and chemical psychotechnologies, it shares some commonalities with Timothy Leary's SMILE formula, minus the space migration, though this remains, I think, implicit. Indeed, when early transhumanists Max and Vita Moore first published their journal Extropy in 1988, they declared it as being almost precisely what Changing Images of Man was searching for, the vaccine for future shock. And yet, like jetpacks and flying cars, transhumanist technologies have either not appeared or when they have, appear susceptible to the inevitability of enshittification. Most obviously, transhumanism is haunted by its own spectre, that of eugenics. Even if most transhumanists publicly disavow state intervention in human enhancement, its libertarian dreams, as Sobchak put it, are grounded in the freedom to buy, and especially the freedom to sell. Fairly simple technological interventions like RFID chips could be used to track people or are used as part of a VIP scheme for club members. In the case of robotics and AI, as Graeber has said, they were almost in every case the kind that proved most conducive to surveillance, work discipline, and social control. Meanwhile, Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute, which received donations from the likes of Elon Musk, was closed in April of this year, apparently for financial reasons, although the cancellation of transhumanist figurehead and institute's director Nick Bostrom, following revelations of racist emails, surely did nothing to calm fears of a eugenicist streak running through transhumanist discourse. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley tech billionaires like Musk, Thiel, and increasingly subscribe to a transhuman-adjacent philosophy known as long-termism, which various critics see as eugenics by other means. I'm going to jump ahead. I will skip over the conspiracy stuff so we can get to the end. I might come back to it. There we go. So, the point is, I think what's going on in Changing Images now, I'm going to wrap this up because Casper's waving at me. So what's going on in Changing Images, man, is I think related to Fisher's essay on Terminator versus Avatar. Two competing visions, our technological extrapolationist vision and then our evolutionary transformationist vision. This first one is our enshittification, if you like. The problem that we face, or the paradox of overcoming this binary, as Fisher points out, is that we are, as Hollywood tells us itself, we may be always on techno-addicts hooked on cyberspace, but inside our true selves, we are primitives organically linked to the mother planet and victimized by the military-industrial complex. Cameron's Avatar is significant because it highlights the disavowal that is constitutive of late capitalist subjectivity, even as it shows how this disavowal is undercut. We can only play, excuse the typo, we can only play at being inner primitives by virtue of cinematic proto-VR technology, whose very existence presupposes the destruction of the organic idyll of Pandora. As we have seen, just to summarize all this, the enshitffication transhumanism does suggest certain perils and pitfalls, but a close reading of Changing Images of Man reveals a much more careful and considered approach to the question of state intervention in modifying human behavior, as well as an arguably all too optimistic view of the capacity of corporations to embrace an ecological ethic. So the world macro problem, the crisis of crises, still looms on the horizon. Tech becomes enshittified, the bad bastards still run the corporations, and fascism rears its head once more. Perhaps a re-embrace of the groovy science approach, omnidisciplinary, eclectic, and open to the weird and esoteric, as evidenced by this very conference, will provide us with the direction we need to navigate the chapel perilous of our transhuman future. There we go. I skipped over a few.
Now, however, humanity's close ties to the ocean are sinking deeper.